USS Washington was the second of the North Carolina-class battleships. For the ship's design history and technical specs, see Guide 071, which covers the class. Washington was laid down in June 1938 and launched 2 years later in 1940, and commissioned almost a year after that in May 1941. Like her sister, she suffered from vibration issues at speed, although the experience with USS North Carolina meant somewhat patching the problem was done a little bit faster on Washington. She was still undergoing attempted fixes when war broke out, and once a mostly satisfactory solution was in place, she was sent across the Atlantic as a sort of successor to the 6th Battle Squadron, reinforcing the home fleet in Scapa Flow. Unfortunately, she lost her admiral along the way. Her main role at this point was supporting the heavy escort groups that shadowed the Arctic convoys as a guard against sorties from German capital ships based in Norway. But apart from a brief scare that led to the scattering of convoy PQ-17, the big German ships refused to come out to play, and the only action Washington saw as a result was minor damage from a British destroyer's depth charges, which exploded underneath her after the escort ship sank, following it being rammed by the battleship King George V, which had been travelling ahead of Washington. She was then recalled and transferred across to the Pacific, picking up a new admiral, Ching Lee, and managing not to lose him on the way into the combat zone. Refitted with some new equipment, she arrived in time to get stuck into the Guadalcanal campaign, first as a carrier escort, and then as cruisers and destroyers began to run out, she was thrown into the surface fight alongside USS South Dakota and a scratch force of destroyers during the second night action of the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Under Lee's expert command, despite South Dakota losing power and becoming Admiral Kondo's new piñata, Washington managed to get the drop on the battle cruiser Kirishima and destroy it with rapid and precise 16-inch salvos, avoiding practically all return fire. Then it was back to escorting carriers and convoys again, along with another quick refit and yet another, also without success, attempt at solving the vibration at speed issues. This pattern saw her through to the conclusion of the Guadalcanal campaign, and the invasion of the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, where she'd also pick up a habit of shore bombardment. This particular engagement would be livened up somewhat by a collision with the battleship USS Indiana, which cut in front of Washington, and this caused enough of a dent in the bow to require her to be sent back home for repairs, and yet another set of screws. This latter had mixed blessings. She could now hit her top speed just fine, but the vibration issues had now been moved to occur in a 3-knot speed band that was just above normal cruising speed. It was also pretty much the same story in the Mariana and Palau Islands as it had been at the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, until at least the Japanese Navy showed up in force at the Battle of the Philippine Sea, where Washington served alongside her sister and other battleships in a skirmish line guarding against the approach of Japanese aircraft. Whilst the Japanese would launch several other significant offensives during this stage of the war, mostly from the air, Washington also got to take part in a number of offensive raids, in addition to the usual guarding and escorting work. The invasion of the Philippines was next, and this offered Washington, still with Lee aboard, a tantalising chance at a second battleship clash, as Lee was given command of Task Force 34, which would have allowed him to lead Washington, Alabama, Iowa, and New Jersey into combat with Kongo, Haruna, Nagato, and Yamato herself, plus associated cruiser and destroyer actions. But unfortunately for all of us, Halsey ordered Task Force 34 north after the sinking of Musashi, and delayed in sending them back again, and thus they were just too far away to intervene in the Battle of Samar, although Lee did try and get them back at full speed once he was detached. And so it was back to the regularly scheduled service, with Lee swapping over to USS South Dakota in November 1944. Washington would ride out Typhoon Cobra without too many issues, and moved with the fleet progressively closer and closer to the Japanese home islands via Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the latter of which would be her last mission of the war, as she was then detached for an extensive refit in preparation for prolonged operations off the Japanese coast as part of Operation Downfall. But the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki meant that once she was ready for sea again, it was simply time to move US troops home as part of Operation Magic Carpet. Washington was then placed in reserve in 1947, and her light and medium anti-aircraft fit was gradually scavenged for other ships. Some ideas were floated to bring her back into service, but a key sticking point remained her top speed. More was needed to keep up with the carriers, and whilst removing the aft turret and all the belt armour, plus installing new screws and a brand new power plant could just about do it, it would also cost almost as much as she'd cost to build in the first place to accomplish this work, and so she remained in reserve until 1960, when she was removed from service and sold for scrap the following year.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.